nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutya Sha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Dhyuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhira Pali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Hai Churastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Yanikilaga Artha Varga Janani Briyad Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramana Padam Bhajuyugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaramya Nikilaga Varg Nikilartha Sanga Shamani Shrotratritim Sangata Yasvadhyai Rasika Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Pramāmṛtaṁ Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on the earth, Sri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today we proceed further into the Bhaktanam-niṣṭhā prakaranam, the descriptions of the niṣṭhā, or the fixity of Bhaktas. So last time we heard about this well-known verse that was recited by Sriman Mahaprabhu before Jagannath Dev, where he expresses that he's a lowly servant of the servant of the servant of the Gopis' Lord, and as well as an expression in which a bhakta fixed in devotion to Krishna acknowledged the experience sought by followers of the path of Gyan to perceive the inner light of Brahman, and so too prayed nonetheless to perceive the rich blue sapphire-like luster of the divine figure of Sri Krishna. So today we'll hear a couple of more expressions of similar type where a bhakta expresses their niṣṭhā in response to and in contrast to the aims and objectives of those following other paths. So I pick up from verse 76. Rasaṁ praśaṁsantu kavitva-niṣṭhā brahmāmṛtaṁ veda-śiro-niviṣṭāḥ vayaṁ tu guñjā-kalitāvataṁsaṁ gṛhīta-vaṁśaṁ kamapi śrayāmaḥ. Let those who have fixity in poetry praise rasa, and let those who are focused on the forepart of the Veda praise the nectar of Brahman. We, however, take shelter in that extraordinary one, wearing an adornment made of guñjās and holding a flute. So, poetry, or more specifically kavya, is famously defined by Vishwanath Kaviraj in Sahitya Darpana as, quote, a statement the essence of which is rasa. So this is a citation from an author named Yadavendra Puri, who evidently most likely wrote in the 15th or the 14th century. So Vishwanath Kaviraj's work was also, I believe, in the 14th century, give or take a century, but it was certainly before most of the writing here in the Padyavali, to my knowledge. So when this author is speaking of kavya, he's speaking of kavya as most likely defined by Vishwanath Kaviraj or some of his predecessors, perhaps Mamata or others. So here we'll look at the definition of kavya as per the Sahitya Darpan, which is generally more or less the most standard or widely used definition, although there is something of a tradition within kavya literature of what I saw one author wrote as destroying the tradition of destroying the tradition, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it, meaning many of the well-known writers who wrote on kavya all wrote in a way that severely critiqued their predecessors and redefined what was kavya, or redefined the usage of certain terms or the implied sense of certain ornaments and so on. So others have later, written differently than Vishwanath Kaviraj, and earlier definitions did differ, but this one in general is usually widely referred to and serves as a general acquaintance. So when the author is saying, let those who like poetry or who focused on kavya, let them praise that. Let them be satisfied with that. So when he says rasa, when he says kavya, what does he mean here? So kavya is defined as a statement the essence of which is rasa. So in this context, the word rasa, obviously here we're not talking about bhakti rasa, we're not talking about Rupa Goswami's rasa, but we're talking about the definition of rasa that pre-existed Rupa Goswami's writing, which literally the word rasa means that which is tasted, rasyate anena iti rasaha, refers to an experience of aesthetic delight, and is further defined as follows. So Jib Goswami refers to this definition of lokik rasa in the Priti Sandarbha. So, quote, undivided, self-manifest, constituted of experience of bliss, free from the touch of any other object to be cognized, the brother of which is relish of Brahman, and the life of which is extraordinary wonder. This, rasa, is relished by virtue of a predominance of sattva within the mind, by some qualified perceivers, as being non-different from the self like one's body. So there are different commentaries on this verse. This is actually a very intricate subject. I'm not trying to go into the subtleties of this particular view or definition of kavya, but just to give a general acquaintance with the idea, which is basically that a person with a sattvic mind can have this experience which is full of wonder, which is completely absorbing, such that they're so into the experience they don't realize they're having the experience. So when it's perceived as non-different from the self, like the body, means they're just into it. They're not aware that they're now experiencing it. They're just experiencing it. The way, loosely speaking, the way someone might watch a football match or a movie and then suddenly notice that an hour has passed without any even thought of time because they were so into what they were watching. So an experience which is full of bliss, which is a continuous stream where it's undivided, it's free from any other object. In other words, there's just one focus going on continuously, and it's like the brother of relish of Brahman. In other words, in the world, it's the closest thing that's like what it is to realize Brahman, and so on and so forth. So this is how rasa, what is experienced by means of kavya, how it is generally viewed. So from a worldly perspective, sounds great. And although it doesn't qualify as rasa as defined here, even still in modern society, the experience that people have through cinema, through sport, through other ways of identifying with something and then experiencing wonder in the course of an unpredictable unfolding, this is, still largely, the way that most people experience the majority of whatever so-called enjoyment they do in their life. But anyway, moving on. So we've defined kavya, we've defined rasa. So now the poet here speaks of fixity or niṣṭhā in kavya. So this is the niṣṭhā prakaran. So he's emphasizing this point of what someone is focused on or what's their fixity. So he's excuse me. So those who foster fixity in, that is great affinity for an engagement with poetry or kavya, praise such rasa, that is worldly or lokik rasa, because they consider it the means to all that they seek to attain in life. So also, Vishwanath Kaviraj cites an earlier kavya author, which praises kavya or praises the rasa that one can experience through kavya, saying that cultivation, meaning composition and study of kavya, leads to proficiency in dharma, artha, kama, moksha, and the arts, as well as renown and pleasure. So if you become skilled in writing poetry and composing poetry and presenting poetry and appreciating poetry, then you'll acquire dharma, you'll acquire wealth, you'll acquire objects that you can enjoy, you'll become skilled in the arts, you'll become famous, you'll experience pleasure. And he even says that this will lead to moksha. Now, many persons who follow the path of Gyan will question this bit. I've seen some remarks from some followers of the Gyanamarg saying, you want to tell me all these, this court poetry praising the figure of, the feminine form, that this is leading people to moksha? So that bit is sometimes debated. But from a broader sense, it also has its place in that if you take it more broadly, that the scope of poetry as a whole does also cover aspects that relate to the path of gyan or the attainment of moksha. So in a looser sense, someone could also make the case. Whatever it may be, the reason I cite this passage is just to say that someone who's into kavya is going to quote this and say, look, you can get everything from kavya: dharma, artha, kama, moksha, fame, all the enjoyment you want, liberation. You can get everything. So why would you not be into kavya? So this is what a kavya person would be enthusiastic about, and they would speak about these benefits to praise kavya, and then start filling your ear with some of the poetry that they find appreciable, and in that way, pass on some of their enthusiasm about that. So here, our author is saying, go ahead. In other words, the subtle implication is like, I've heard all that. I'm well acquainted with what people think is, or what is thought to be the great benefit of kavya, and ultimately, I'm not impressed, or ultimately, I don't consider that most worthy of my time and engagement. So then he moves to the jnanis. So those who are focused on the forepart of the Veda refers to experts in the Shruti Shastra, principally the Upanishads and other texts that teach the path to realization of non-differentiated Brahman. That is, the section of the Vedas known as the Jnana-kanda. Brahman is regarded as, quote, nectar, amritam, by them because it is relishable like nectar to them, meaning it is the ultimate object they seek to experience, which they consider will lead them to the ultimate experience of fulfillment. So the word amrita can both refer to, an aesthetic experience of the highest order, just as nectar is sometimes used to speak of the most pleasurable possible beverage you could drink, which is then an indicator of the most pleasurable experience that you could have of any type. Or, from the other sense, amritam can also refer to the idea of immortality and this idea of experiencing something beyond death, beyond suffering, beyond the world. So when Brahman is spoken of as amrita, you get a blend of these two elements, where you're going to get the highest, what's considered to be the highest state of pleasure or bliss, and something that's beyond all the suffering of samsara and beyond transience. It's eternal and satisfying, etc. So the followers of the Vedanta, the experts in the Upanishads, they're going to say, don't bother with this kavya ras, you want the amrita of Brahman. So our poet here is intentionally choosing these two words, rasa and amrita, because they both they're both words that are used to epitomize the experience of pleasure or satisfaction, and they both do so by referring to something that's also thought to be like a beverage. So he's sort of putting the two of them together and saying, somebody wants rasa, somebody wants amrita, fine, drink your rasa, drink your amrita. In other words, go right ahead, but as great as you might make it sound that I should have this beverage or that beverage, sorry, I'm not signing up to drink with y'all. So in the second half of the verse, he explains why not. The expression of the author here is one of respectful and confident disinterest. Quote, those who favor study of poetry or the Shrutis praise the rasa and nectar they respectively prefer. Let them do so. For us, however, Sri Krishna is rasa, Sri Krishna is amrita. In other words, we're interested in Krishna, and whatever concept of rasa you have, whatever concept of amrita you have, that's fine. As far as we're concerned, we'll get all that and more in our Krishna. He is rasa, he is amrita, bhakti to him, darshan of him, seva to him, that is rasa, that is amrita. This is what he wants to, his implication. So thus he says, we, however, take shelter in that extraordinary one, meaning in Sri Krishna, who is by his very nature beyond the scope of prakriti and the very essence of rasa and amrita. To allude to Sri Krishna's allure as such, he describes him as wearing an adornment made of guñjās and holding a flute, thus suggesting that his charming appearance and the sound, the rasa, of his flute songs are more extraordinary than the rasa of any conventional form of kavya and the experience of non-differentiated Brahman. So in this way, similar to the previous verse, the Vaishnava poet, using some wit and charm, conveys his niṣṭhā, or his affinity and attraction for the path of bhakti, and his Ishta Devata, Sri Krishna of Vrindavan, in contrast to being, a connoisseur of Lokik rasa, or a follower of the Jnana-marg. So next we have another verse, which is also of the same type. Or in other words, dealing with the same contrast in a similar way. So we can also just note that the fact that Rupa Goswami is citing 1, 2, 3 of these verses from different authors shows that there must have been quite a significant amount of discourse on this subject matter in that era. In other words, in the 14th century, 15th century, there must have been quite a lot of cultural discussion, if you will, amongst the followers of these different paths, and refined compositions from both sides seeking to exalt the particular ideal, the particular niṣṭhā that individuals felt. So that's gives us some sort of insight or idea into what might have been a topic of that era that was significant, if you will. But one thing we can note is in these things there's respect, or there's never a statement of one is right and one is wrong. Rather, there's let it be and let it be. You want to praise this, you want to drink this, okay, go for it. You like that, okay, go for it. But I'm into this. But I want this, I want to see this light, I want to drink this beverage. There's a difference based on something aesthetic, something of personal sense of taste, as opposed to simply trying to argue that the scripture's ultimate verdict is only this and not that. The work that Jiva Goswami has done in the Sandarbhas to systematically discuss qualified Brahman, unqualified Brahman, put that together in the Advaya Gyan Tattva, and then shows step by step a gradation in Ananda. These were, you could say, theological efforts in this era to give grounding, so to speak, for what prior to that may have been a type of niṣṭhā, or a spirit which was perhaps less grounded in concrete and highly detailed theology, and perhaps more of a I don't want to say in a demeaning sense, like more of a sentimental, or more of evoking something that was evoked by virtue of a deep samskar for bhakti and shraddha in an Ishta Devata that was generated through a rich culture of bhakti in that cultural environment, and that with that, you could say, aesthetic appeal, with that intensity of affinity that was felt. I'm not claiming this, but I'm saying perhaps that some of the refined theology that emerged was inspired by this aesthetic basis, or inspired from the heart, so to speak, or it was the heart-driven pursuit of an intellectual fortification. That may be, what may have inspired some to write or to interpret the Bhagavatam as they did. And, for us as followers of the Gaudiya tradition, or rather as persons who appreciate the Gaudiya tradition, we can see that those two things, after that edifice is built, so to speak, and you come along and you arrive when it's all already made, then sometimes there can be the tendency to emphasize the theological authority, or the hermeneutics that establish the scriptural precedents for the things. But while that's all certainly valuable, and that's one way of establishing niṣṭhā and shraddha in people, there can be something lost, or if there isn't, to counterbalance that, a significant emphasis and a significant culturing of the aesthetic features of the theology. In other words, the beauty of the Ishtadevata, the beauty of the Dham, the beauty of the bhakti, of the prem that's exchanged between Bhagavan and his parikaras. That is actually what the thing is about, so to speak, ultimately, and where all of the theological discussion leads you to, and whether you're actually proficient in articulating all that much of the theological subtlety or not may not be ultimately consequential, but the intensity of the hankering, the intensity of desire in the heart that one has for that object, for that Ishtadevata, for bhakti of that purity, bhakti of that nature, of that beauty, that is something that we can say appeals directly to the heart of Bhagavan, even more so than one's knowledge of the texts about him or the precedents for his being such, as if you will. And it's less one's knowledge of him, but more that attraction of the heart for him that can evoke his grace, and that can ultimately bring out a sustained motivation and a perseverant spirit in one's bhakti sadhana. So these type of expressions, this type of poetry, it's not a joke. In other words, it's not just, for fun, or it's not just a flowery way of describing it, but to culture these aesthetic elements is as much, if not more important than understanding the theology, ultimately to reach the goal. Now, to have the theological foundation well set up in the earlier stages, grand. That'll give you a solid way of going about this. But if in the course of establishing that theological edifice, one only sits on that and, is in a less rich or of a less spirited or hearty manner, remains at that level of cultivation, then they won't have entered into the fullness of the path that the Goswamis have laid out, and that texts like we're reading now are there to support people on. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble on too much, but some context historically and in the context of the corpus of our tradition, where some of these statements might fall or be perceived to be of relevance. So, a third expression, contrasting jnana and bhakti. Dhyānātītaṁ kimapi paramam jetu jānanti tattvaṁ teṣām āstāṁ hṛdaya-kuhare śuddha-cin-mātra atma asmakam tu prakṛti-madhuraḥ smera-vaktrāravindo megha-śyāmaḥ kanaka-paridhiḥ paṅkajākṣo'yam. Let the Atma, as pure consciousness alone, remain in the hollow of the hearts of they who know only of some ultimate existent beyond meditation. But in ours, this Atma with sweet nature, mildly smiling lotus face, cloud blue complexion, golden garments, and lotus eyes. So there's a very deliberate usage of the word Atma here twice. If you look in the verse, the end of the second line and the first two lines which describe the Gyan object, and then the second two lines both ending in the word Atma, describing Krishna. This is to show an understanding of an ontological oneness between the two, and yet to at the same time, in so stating that state of equivalence or that state of oneness between them, also emphasizing on other grounds the difference between them. So we'll look at some of this in the commentary. And I also have here a passage from the Bhakti Sandarbha, which, like the one we discussed in the past, also shows significantly the recognition that Jiva Goswami gives on the basis of the Bhagavatam for the path of Gyan, as something taught in the Bhagavatam, taught by none other than Bhagavan Sri Krishna, and therefore, in all respects, something that has, full scriptural or divine precedent, if you will, and therefore is something to be respected, acknowledged, and, given freedom to, so to speak, for those who are so inclined to it. So I'll present this. The division of that is of intentness, samukya, upon the paratattva, in the form of direct approach or upasana thereof, is shown throughout the Shastras to be of numerous types. So this is also Jiva Goswami's genius, to thread everything together by, rather than speaking about Gyan and Bhakti as two different things, creating a more generalized single category of sammukya or unmukata, and then saying that thing, this orientation towards, or to be facing towards this, then, or to be intent upon it, can then acquire these different manners of being such. So then he presents Gyan and Bhakti as subcategories of a singular broad category, rather than two separate items, or two separate paths entirely. So, in this regard, intentness is in general of two types. One related to the unqualified or non-differentiated nirvishesh aspect of the paratattva, and the other related to the qualified or differentiated savishesh aspect of the paratattva. Herein, the former is referred to as Gyan, the latter, on the contrary, is of two types: ahangrahopasana, taking oneself as the object of worship in the approach, and that the form of which is referred to as bhakti. The characteristic of this aforementioned type known as Gyan is described as follows by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Srimad Bhagavatam 11:19-21. Quote, as vision of oneness of the self with the Supreme Self, and vision of oneness of the self with the Supreme Self is known as Gyan. The meaning being that an approach or upasana of non-distinction between the self and the Supreme Self, i.e. a form of upasana focused on realization of this non-distinction, is known as Gyan. The manner of practice thereof, furthermore, is similarly said to be of many types in various places throughout the Shastras. That jnana sadhana in various forms is also called jnana itself. Therein, hearing, shravanam, is the first part of the sadhana. So he's building this upon the well-known statement in the Brihadaranyaka, Atmare drashtabhya shrotabhya mantabhya nididhyasitabhya, that the Atma is to be perceived, which means it is first to be heard about, then to be contemplated, and then to be meditated upon. So then he's using that as a structure and describing the jnana sadhana in that order. So the first shrotabhya means that the practice is then shravanam, or hearing. So therein, hearing, the first part of the sadhana, is to be observed in the conversation of Sri Prithu and Sanat Kumar, described in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam and elsewhere. Contemplation, manana, in accord with that, meaning with what one's heard, is also to be understood. That is, should be understood as the second step in the process. Firstly, listener's discernment reaches to an extent whereby the existent constituted solely of consciousness distinct from matter, that is unqualified Brahman, is regarded to exist. So when one hears the Upanishads, when one hears these other texts, or as was shown in the conversation of Sanat Kumar and Prithu Maharaj, there is teaching of this existent, who's made of consciousness, and who's not matter, who's transcendent to the world. So there's, first of all, this acquaintance such that one acquires the idea that that exists. In this state, they are not able to discern that in that existent constituted solely of consciousness, the qualities existing therein by virtue of its inherent potency, the forms of which are bhagavata, and so forth, just as those possessed only of eyes of flesh are not able to discern in the luminary constituted solely of light that is known as the sun, the qualities inside and outside the orb thereof, in the form of divine airplanes and the like, and the mutually distinctly existent particles in the rays of light thereof. So, this is, spoken for and using an analogy that's understood by persons steeped in the Puranic culture. So, for them, it's considered what you call a prasiddhi, or just a well-known fact, that the sun is not just an orb in the sky, but it's actually the abode of a devata named Surya, and that this Surya dwells there, and that there are, airplanes and other entities, and there's a whole community there, so to speak. So he's using that as a point of reference with the idea that this is something people already know and accept. So at least for some of us who weren't raised in a culture who had that idea, and in the modern day where the prominence of empiricism, this might not appear like a precedent that one would want to pin their argument on. But in his era, it evidently was considered suitable. But nevertheless, to mention also this idea of particles of light, or light rays in these particles coming out from the sun, and using that to refer to this idea of Shaktiman and Shakti, or of a bearer of Shakti, and then Shaktis or qualities manifest by Shaktis that are possessed by that bearer. So when this concept of Nirvishesh Brahman is taught, that same entity who's being described as Nirvishesh can also be Savishesh, who's being described as Ni-Shakti, or without Shakti, because it's something that doesn't contain directly within it the Shaktis of the empiric plane, that it also can have Shaktis of its own, which are not of this nature, that may not ever be explained. So he's saying that when people may be acquainted or given the idea of a Ni-Shakti Nirvishesh Brahman, then he says they're not able to discern that in that existent, constituted solely of consciousness, the qualities existing therein by virtue of its inherent potency, the forms of which are bhagavatva, and so forth. So this is, again, I know it sounds a bit funny in English, but this methodology of using things referred to always as abstract nouns comes from Nyaya discourse, and can sound kind of a roundabout way of speaking, but it sharpens the idea of the guna and the drabya, or the object and the quality, and makes it clear where and when and what potential relationship can exist between which qualities and which objects. So he's saying that he's turning Bhagavan not as a drabya, or an object or a substance, but rather referring to the state of being Bhagavan as like a quality that's also existent in this paratattva. So by construing the Brahman aspect and the Bhagavan aspect as like gunas within this singular drabya, you get this advaya gyan tattva, you get this holistic reality that's all encompassing and can have different faces, if you will, or different appearances simultaneously without there being any contradiction in that, or in the validity of what are otherwise completely different experiences. Just as if you walk into a room and it's full of beautiful decorations, and then someone else walks into the same room and says, oh, it's just a bunch of bare walls. Ordinarily, you'd say that's impossible. You can't walk into the same room and have one experience of it being bare walls and another experience of it being fully beautifully decorated. But in the case of the absolute, or in the case of this paratattva, someone can perceive it as, bare light, so to speak, and someone else could perceive it as, the most rich ever new expression of wonders, and that those two things can simultaneously coexist without contradiction. So this is essentially what he's driving at, and saying that those who are acquainted only with one idea, they may not have that awareness of the other. So he says, this is the purport. That is, those who take up the path of Gyan and hear and contemplate the teachings related to it, acquire an understanding of the existence of the paratattva, such that they consider the paratattva to exist only without qualities, and thus seek to realize the aspect of the paratattva known as unqualified Brahman, rather than the qualified aspect of the paratattva known as Bhagavan. Furthermore, as was discussed previously, if one, that is someone engaged in jnana sadhana, becomes endowed with divine vision by the special grace of a mahat, then realization of the qualities of the paratattva, namely bhagavatva and so forth, shall also occur. If not, then by means of experience of Brahman as unqualified and constituted solely of consciousness, one merely becomes absorbed in that aspect of the paratattva without manifest qualities. There, meaning these Gyan Sadhaka's meditation, or nidhi dhyasanam, is also of the very same manner. That is described in the Bhagavad 2.2.15 and 16 as follows. O dear one, when an ascetic, having become situated in a stable, comfortable posture, intends to leave this plane, meaning body, he should not fix the mind on the time or the place. Having mastered the vital air, he should regulate the senses with the mind, regulate the mind with his own taintless intellect, merge this intellect into the perceiver of the field, merge this perceiver of the field into the self, and merge the self into the ultimate self, or the Atma, meaning Brahman. And becoming steadfast and possessed of tranquility, finally withdraw from action entirely, since there is nothing more for him to attain. So this is an instance where the Bhagavatam describes this process of jnana sadhana by which the Atma is realized as Brahman. So this is, I felt, very relevant here because precisely in the verse that we're discussing, there's this statement, let the Atma as pure conscious alone remain in the hollows of the hearts of those who know only of some existent beyond meditation. So then this description of Jnana sadhana that Jiva Goswami cites from the Bhagavatam matches exactly with what's being described there, where the person only knows that as they go through this meditation of withdrawing and retracting their awareness from the senses, the intellect, etc., they come to this ultimate Atma that they understand to be Brahman. So this is how we see the work of, or this path laid out by Jiva Goswami on the basis of the Bhagavatam. So, with reference to this analysis by Sri Jivapad, the mention in the verse under discussion of the Atma as pure consciousness alone can be understood to refer to unqualified Brahman, and to be spoken of as being known by those who meditated upon it as, quote, some ultimate existent, to convey that such sadhakas have not received the grace of a bhakta mahanta, whereby they can realize that this ultimate existent, or paratattva, that they meditate upon in a less specific manner as unqualified Brahman, is actually also eternally and inherently self-endowed with innumerable, wonderful, purely spiritual qualities in its Bhagavan aspect, which is referred to in this verse as, quote, this Atma with sweet nature, mildly smiling lotus face, cloud blue complexion, golden garments, and lotus eyes, and which produces bliss of a vastly greater magnitude than the bliss felt in realization of the unqualified aspect thereof, as the compiler has described in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Quote, if this bliss of Brahman were accumulated for a prarardha, meaning 50 quadrillion years, it would still not equal even an infinitesimal droplet of the ocean of the joy of bhakti. So that's about as strongly as you could possibly say it. Using one of the biggest units that you can find in classical Sanskrit discourse, and using that measure of comparison to contrast the bliss of Brahman with the bliss of bhakti. So, in the discussion in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of servants of Sri Bhagavan, that is, accomplished Siddha Bhaktas who relish dasya rasa, the compiler speaks of 4 categories of servants. And within the second category thereof, known as ashritas, or the sheltered, he discusses a subcategory known as gyani-charas, or former gyanis, which he defines as follows. Quote, those led by Shonaka have completely relinquished desire for moksha and become fully sheltered in Hari alone, are referred to by the wise are referred to by the wise of, I think that should be as, sorry about that, gyani-charas. And I think that also should be, sorry gosh, I think I have 2 mistakes in here. Anyway, so the reason I'm bringing this up is that the verse that we're talking about now in Padyavali is also quoted by Rupa Goswami to explain who are these gyani-charas. So Rupa Goswami has quoted this verse here in Padyavali. He's also quoted it in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So he then cites the verse under discussion as an illustration of the attitude of these servants of Sri Bhagavan who were formerly gyanis. Sri Jivapad and Sri Chakravartipad comment on this verse as follows. In the first half of the verse, even one who is aware of one aspect of the paratattva is indicated to be as though unaware of the paratattva with the intention of dismissibility. That is, with the intent of implying that the attitude fostered by the jnana sadhakas alluded to in the first half of the verse ought to be discarded in favor of the attitude of a bhakta of Sri Bhagavan described later in the verse. On account of certainty, that is, on account of the author of the verse speaking with confidence about his conviction in the path of bhakti, wherein the qualified aspect of the paratattva, that is Sri Bhagavan, is meditated upon and realized while demonstrating he has full awareness of the nature of the path of Gyan, leading to realization of unqualified Brahman as well. This Atma of lotus eyes, or paṅkajākṣo'yam Atma, is stated because of this Atma's being the Supreme Lord and being supremely dear to the Bhakta speaking the verse. So it's a little bit of peculiar language, so to speak, to refer to the Atma as having eyes and a complexion and so forth, because usually the term Atma is spoken of in a more abstracted context. But to use that word, which is common in the discourse related to Vedanta, related to the path of Gyan, and then using rich language typically used to describe the personal features of Bhagavan or the personal features of Krishna, and then using that language in connection with the more philosophical or neutral term Atma, creates a relishable contrast in this context, where that Atma that you meditate on and that you consider to be nirvishesh, that Atma has lotus eyes, and that Atma has a blue complexion. This Atma we prefer. So that's also one point to note, is that in the verse, then there is a pronoun attached to the second mention of Atma. So there's, a sort of a play between them being the same and them being different at the same time, by saying, you see this, you let this Atma, remain in your heart, let you perceive that, and we'll perceive this Atma, something like this. So one other point that I also find interesting is that in this case, and as we see going through, in places where the verses in the Padyavali are also quoted in other works of Rupa Goswami, such as the Stavamala or the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and we have commentary from Jiva Goswami or Vishnath Chakravarti or Baladeva Dibhushan on those works, our commentator here in Padyavali doesn't quote that. In other words, he writes commentary on the verse, but he doesn't seem to always interact with the pre-existent commentary on those same verses from earlier writers within our tradition. So in some cases what he says gels quite well with instances where we have commentary for Baladeva Dibhushan or from Jiva Goswami, and in some cases he gives different interpretations. So that's one reason why sometimes I put both, sometimes I omit, according to what seems to be suitable to our purpose and our general understanding. All right, then let's do one more. The next one is not too long. If I go a couple minutes over, I beg your pardon. So, next, the compiler cites another expression of a bhakta's fixity, wherein a sadhu describes to another qualified bhakta of similar heart his fixity in Sri Bhagavan. Jatu prarthayate na prartivaparam naindre pade modate sandate na cha yoga siddhi shuddhiyam moksham cha na kaṅkṣati kalindi vanasimani sthiratarin megha-śyāmaḥ kevalam śuddhe brahmani balavi bhujalata badhe manodhavati. Neither does my mind ever desire the domain of an earthly king, nor ever wish for the domain belonging to Indra, nor ever seek the attainments of yoga, nor ever hanker for moksha. Rather, ever my mind only runs after he who resembles the luster of a cloud, surrounded by stationary lightning, situated on the edge of the forest along the Kalindi, pure Brahman, bound in the vines of the Balavi's arms. So, the possessive pronoun my is supplied in the translation in accord with the author's intent, even though it's not literally stated in the verse. This is a point made by the commentator. The domain belonging to Indra refers to the kingdom of Svarga. The attainments of yoga refers to the acquisition of the siddhis known as anima and so on. The word ever, jatu, is intended to be supplied to each element in the verse, meaning the author wishes to convey that his mind is attracted and pursues only Bhagavan Sri Krishna and no other object. So that's why you see it running in brackets again and again. Sri Krishna is described as pure Brahman to convey that the Paratattva's form as Sri Krishna of Braja is supremely wonderful and alluring, and that the author's mind thus remaining ever attracted to him, such that it is perpetually running after him, is most natural. Sorry, I might have to fix something there. Anyway, I'll get back to it. But another point I'll make here is that, as in the previous statement, some of this usage of the terms Atman and Brahman in contrast with, or in the context of vivid descriptions of Krishna's personal Leela and activity in Vrindavan, also carries some of this sort of, they also have a certain relish or a certain edge to them because of the typical use of those language only in philosophical contexts, or largely in philosophical contexts. So to now, rather than, if you had just said, oh, Krishna is with the gopis, then it would, so to speak, sound plain. But when you use Shuddha Brahman, so to speak, then you catch the ear of persons who are associated with Vedantic discourse, and it creates a certain theological implication to what's being said, which is part of what's being alluded to here, or part of what's sort of being pushed in the verse, is both a charming depiction of the Ishtadevata and a statement about the ontological standing of him as well. And this verse is also interesting in that the author is saying that my mind doesn't desire any of these other things. So, wow, what a blessed state of mind to be in. As we'll come to soon, Mahaprabhu has this verse, na dhanam, na janam, na sundarim kavitam va, where he's saying, let me have only causeless bhakti, I don't desire this, I don't desire that. The implication being that it's very difficult for sadhakas to overcome all these other desires. Rupa Goswami says, anyabilashita shunyam, this bhakti is free from desirousness of anything else. So it's principally desire that is the obstacle, or the thing that needs to be worked on and changed in one sense, or transmuted, or whatever you want to call it, for someone to reach the state of bhava and prema and experience of Krishna anubhav and so forth. So for this, to read a poem in which someone is speaking with that freedom, with that capability for their mind to just run uninhibited and unchecked and unthwarted by so many other worldly desires or distractions created by lingering, past samskaras and so forth. Wow. That would be what a wonderful experience, if I could, perhaps an analogy, at least for persons who grew up like me in a beach town, when you're a young kid and you go to the beach and you see these adults out surfing on the waves, and you think, wow, that would be the most thrilling experience to be able to swim. And on top of that, to be able to ride one of these boards. It's like you're flying along the wave. That looks amazing. And it just seems like such a magical thing to watch. I remember I had a friend of mine's father was a surfer, and sometimes we would see him out there on the waves and when we were little kids, and it just seemed like such a wonderful thing, to this freedom, so to speak. So something like that, if you apply that to the mental sphere, to be able for the mind to just flow like that, to just move completely and to run only towards Krishna. What sort of a thrilling experience, comparable to the thrill of, surfing or skiing or some even motorcycling maybe for some, that would be like, like a most relishable state of mind. So this is, I think, also something we can draw as an implication for sadhakas, or for persons who are very much struggling with, or who very much are beset with the residual presence of so many material attachments, to hear this type of poetry about Vaishnavas, experiencing that freedom, that state of having that one-pointedness of desire. It's inspiring in the way that, as you might hear an athlete speak about the joy they feel when they surf or ski or something like that, and that might inspire one to take up such a practice or something. Not that I'm trying to inspire people to do anything like that, but something like this is something we can also draw from, given that, sadhana is defined as that, the aim of which is bhav, and bhav is defined as having the principal characteristic of desirousness only of Krishna. So the very target, so to speak, that we're aiming at is the state of the mind having desirousness only of him, which, when it does, becomes like that, like a stallion running free rein. So here he's saying, my mind only runs after he who resembles the luster of a cloud, surrounded by stationary lightning. and to again compare Brahman, the word Brahman, its root bream, referring to that which is the greatest, that which is the greater and ever becoming greater, that greater than which nothing can exist. We have all these, technical definitions of the idea of Brahman. So then to choose that word Brahman, that most vast, expansive, all-pervading, never surpassable entity, to say that now Brahman is bound, to say that he's now confined, is also an intended ornament of contrast. And on top of that, to say he's bound in the vines of the Balavi's arms, then also brings that theological ornament of contradiction into the context of an image that evokes remembrance of Krishna's Madhura Rasa Lila. This is no doubt something that the Vaishnava Kavis of that era, and as we'll see also with Raghupati Upadhyay's work that will come soon, definitely I think was a favored theme of many Vaishnavas in that time. Okay, I'm a little over time, but let me just read the remaining discussion here. So Sri Krishna is being further described as he who resembles the luster of a cloud surrounded by stationary lightning, alludes to his being of swarthy complexion and dressed in yellow garments, that he is, quote, bound in the vines of the Balavi's arms, alludes to his being embraced with prema by the gopis, and thus to the superlative nature of their eternal prema lila. Alternately, the word Balavi can be interpreted as singular and allude to Sri Krishna's being embraced with prema by Sri Radhika, specifically the foremost of the gopis. The implication being that Sri Krishna's lila with Sri Radhika is the foremost manifestation of the Paratattva, as Sri Jivapad states at the conclusion of his discussion throughout the first four of his Sandarbhas on the essential nature of the Sambandhi Tattva, that is, the Supreme Existent, who is the bearer of the referer-referent relationship with Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, even among all the intensely blissful and astonishing manifestations of Sri Krishna, and even with those found in Sri Vrindavan, the supremely wonderful manifestation is that of Sri Krishna coupled with Sri Radha. So as Jiva Goswami ends all of his theological analysis on this point, then I put in here that point after a series of verses dealing with this discussion of the Paratattva and its aspects, ultimately ending with this verse that evokes an image of that same point. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share. Yes. Yes, you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
Thank you very much for this inspiring class and for these very beautiful explanations. I have a little question about one word in the verse 76, in the very beginning, where Krishna is described as wearing an adornment made of guñjās. What does the word guñjās mean?
Guñjā is a berry which hardens to become like a shell. So these are used to make necklaces. There are black varieties, white varieties, and rarely some other colors. And these are said to be favored decorations or items that Krishna wears. He's described as wearing necklaces of guñjā. Sometimes he's described as having a string of guñjās wrapped around his top knot, and sometimes blend of the black and the white, or sometimes by black I mean the black with, it has red spots, but it's predominantly black, and the other ones are usually all white. So sometimes those two combine together. So this is a favored ornament. That's something considered to be part of the natural native fauna Braj, one of the features of Krishna's appearance, which is unique to his Vrindavan aspect in contrast to Narayan or an aesthetic that he presents himself with in Vaikuntha and elsewhere. It's one of the special features of his Vrindavan appearance and one of the numerous special ornaments of the forest, so to speak, that he holds as his own and which is thus very much cherished by his Bhaktas.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, Brahman. I had a question about this contemplation of the theological points that Jiva Goswami makes. So my feeling or my perception is that this enriches the experience of rasa for some people. Because I'm thinking like in the conversation of Sriman Mahaprabhu with Shri Sanatan, where he initially discusses many of these points or discusses also the Aishwarya of Bhagavan, and then it kind of builds up and almost like, how do you say, like it runs over and then it becomes a discussion on Madhurya or the more sweet aspects of Bhagavan. So is that a correct understanding that these points can enrich the experience of Bhakti Rasa? And perhaps for some it's not necessary, but for some it might have that effect.
I think, yeah, broadly speaking, we could say that that's the case. Although, if we wanted to be edgy, if you will, or point out contours, we can say that rasa is ultimately something that's experienced only by siddha bhaktas, or those who've reached the stage of bhava bhakti and acquired a stayi bhav, as all the ingredients of rasa manifest from the stayi bhav. So, at the stage of that stayi bhav becoming self-manifested into the citta, then that agency of the Sarup Shakti is downloading, if you will, the experience, and exactly how much theological knowledge someone had prior to that direct influence of the Sarup Shakti in their purified psyche may not be consequential at that stage. So, from that perspective, we can say that the level of theological knowledge that someone has doesn't have a direct bearing on the experience of rasa. But from a broader perspective of sadhakas aspiring to reach that state, then we can say it's subjective to the capacity, the cultural background, and the inclination of individuals. But for many, having a significantly fortified theological understanding of all aspects of the Advaya Gyan Tattva is highly conducive to the conviction and the certainty in the nature of the whole process and of the object that one seeks in going about this. And we can say, if it weren't important, why would the Goswamis have spent such an effort to establish it? It was obviously something that was critical to the survival of our tradition in the intellectual context of the century in which it was made. And if it didn't have that kind of like robust fortification and integration with the existing scriptural discourse, the existing scriptural precedents, and that strength, if you will, to be vetted by persons who also will analyze it from different perspectives, then it may not have ever attracted qualified people to carry it on through the centuries. And persons may not have, who have that cultural background of conviction in the praman of the Shastra and who are already acquainted with other viewpoints on the nature of the conclusions of the Vedanta and so forth, unless those things are dealt with in a very lucid, very solid manner, why would someone who's already immersed in a solid, robust tradition take any interest at all? They wouldn't, So those things are extremely valuable for the dignity as well as the depth of the sampradaya and its integration into the broader, Sanatan Dharma world, if you will. So in that sense, it's something that's very supportive to people also taking this up in the right way, because what that also does is it insulates or it preempts a lot of fanaticism and narrow-mindedness or shallowness in the specificity of the path that actually at the same time retains a wide scope of integration. In other words, on the one hand, the Raganuga Bhakti path is extremely specific, much more so than the Christian tradition, if I can make such a broad generalization, and even other Vaishnava traditions, to get this kind of honed in on, nope, Paramatma and Bhagavan are not actually the same, and this Bhagavan is actually, ontologically not equal to that one. I mean, for persons even in other Vaishnava Sampradayas, this is what? How is Paramatma not the same as Bhagavan? How is Narayan and Ram? Some of these things can be, even throw people off, so to speak. The level of precision and analysis of gradation that that Goswamis have gone to. So all of that, at the same time that it creates specificity, it's been done when, if you're taught it systematically and comprehensively, that you also don't lose respect for or see the dignity and the scriptural precedent for so many other paths of bhakti, and as well as the path of gyan. So this is actually, if you look at it in, the context of like a social unfolding of ideas on this place called Earth, it's actually really great in the sense that it's created something that's focused on aesthetics, but yet has so much theological breadth that it's not going to create more division and factioning within the study, unless, of course, you propagate it in a watered-down missionary manner whereby the beauty of it is lost. But that's another issue. The point I'm making is that they've written it in such a way that you can have deep conviction and focus on this particular thing, and yet also in a heartbeat have complete respect and a complete ethic of the importance of honoring persons whose focus is very different than oneself. And that balance, from a humanist perspective, is amazing because it enables people to be passionate, but also not end up arrogant, and to go deep, so to speak, without necessarily, becoming socially dysfunctional, but a way of creating like an integration with the broader social fabric that allows for harmonious dealings on a wide scale and also deep, rich pursuit and experience on an inter or a micro scale. So those are some of my personal ways that I appreciate the way that the Gaudiya theology was built. And therefore, I'm inclined to think that, loosely speaking, for people who are navigating, the modern world, that all of these teachings have a lot of utility in giving them conviction and ability to focus and pursue such a high ideal as the experience of bhakti rasa. And therefore, they do, so to speak, support that, if you will, in the sense that they're highly instrumental in sadhakas coming to the path and progressing on the path in a healthy and beautiful way. And then, there comes a stage where other things kick in, if you will, or what I described at the beginning. And so it's also subjective, exactly what level of theological subtlety which sadhaka goes to. There's no hard and fast rule about that. It depends on personal capacity, it depends on personal inclination. So there's a sliding scale in that regard as far as I understand. But at least whatever capacity people have, at least let that capacity be guided by accurate education. This much is desired. Anyway, I'll stop there. I hope that somewhere if I touched on what you brought up.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right, well, I'll conclude here. And if we're so blessed, then we'll dive further into these expressions of Bhaktas' niṣṭhā in our next reading of Padyavali. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you.